They told me that I'm a traitor to my own profession.
I mean, yeah. Welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is July 22nd, and you just heard from Leana 1, MD. COVID denier, COVID minimizer, everybody get back to work during a pandemic whipcracker. And this video is all about COVID-19. In this video, we're going to particularly focus on long COVID, which is the lingering effects that a significant amount of people who become infected with the SARS coronavirus 2 for up to a year, sometimes more. And we started with this little clip from Dr. Leana because yesterday, the 21st, it was announced that President Joe Biden has come down with COVID-19, a victim of his administration's own capital-centered policies regarding the pandemic, in response to which she wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, which basically said, this is just as it should be. We live with COVID, get a potentially fatal, potentially disabling disease, no big deal. Go back to work. Look, your president is doing it now. Before we get into that, if you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So we are in the BA5 and BA4 surge right now. After a long plateau since basically late March, the USA has been in an ongoing surge, first driven by BA2, subvariant of Omicron, a relative of the BA1, which drove the December-January wave. And then, about 3 months later, BA2 started coming in and reinfecting people. And now, that didn't even really come down, and BA4 and BA5 have entered the chat, driving the wastewater numbers upward. Not the case numbers so much, because they're not really counting those anymore. A lot of rapid tests and other things interfering with the case count, but if we look at the wastewater, we can see there is a ton of this virus circulating in the population. While it is true that for now, the death count has come down, even as a ratio or proportion of the overall cases, a couple of factors. One, it's been spring and summer. This is when people usually are at their healthiest, getting the most fresh air and sunshine, not having to contend with cold weather, things like that, that typically every year weaken people in November, December, January, February. But, of course, this year, like every year, has seasons. We'll go through summer, and then fall will hit, and then winter, people go inside, people close windows, people aren't outside as much, and a lot more COVID is going to spread. The fact that, again, we're having a spike as significant as this in the summer is concerning, and it's reflective of the fact that we are dealing with new variants, essentially a new virus. The Omicron family is the most mutated form of COVID yet, and of course, it just keeps mutating the more it spreads. Mutation occurs during replication, which occurs during transmission as it finds new hosts, new cells to infect, makes copies of itself, and mutations occur. Sometimes they are disadvantageous to the virus, sometimes they're neutral and go nowhere, but every once in a while, those mutations confer an advantage to the virus. Maybe it's more immune evasion capacity. Maybe it's more virulence. It can make more copies of itself in one go. Whatever it is, it has, over the last 2.5 years, evolved into a significantly more severe, in other words, it causes more disease, it's more virulent, and a much more contagious form of itself. So that's factor one. We're having a big spike in summer, and we are dealing with a new virus. That's a reminder of that. I am not looking forward to this fall and winter, let's put it that way. Number two, a lot of the most vulnerable people have already died. So when we say that, people aren't dying anymore, well, we already lost 1 million people in the United States alone, and counting. So when we say that fewer people are dying, keep these things in mind. It's true now that a lot of people have been vaccinated. To some extent, they've had 1, 2, or 3 shots. People over 60 or 50 have maybe gotten a second booster shot. But the vaccines only go so far. They do reduce symptoms, and they're likely to keep you from dying or ending up hospitalized. They reduce your odds of both. But many breakthrough cases still occur, and the cost of all of this is a lot of wear and tear on the body. We have to stop transmission. That's the bottom line. However, this involves disrupting, quote, business as usual, which is exactly what Leana 1 is here to promote, business as usual. Before we get into that, though, a quick overview of what we're going to be covering in this video, which is number 2 of our BA5 surge COVID update. It comes on the heels of our first video, which was sort of an overview video of the BA5 variant, its capacity to evade immunity, and some other topics. In this video, we're going to talk about the dangers of reinfection. In other words, your second or third infection with the coronavirus is not equal to your first one. Each one seems to be successively worse and to carry increased risks. So letting it rip has never been a worse idea. Let's be clear, there's nothing, evidence-based medicine or evidence-based public health about this approach. Science is constrained by the short-term needs for profit of the capitalists who run this system. And no matter what, science indicates we should do medically or from a public health perspective, the interests of capital are always going to come first. Prime example of ideology, science, knowledge, truth being constrained by the material interests of the ruling class. So, also in this video, we are going to cover, a lot of people have asked about, does the vaccine seem to help with long COVID, reducing the odds of that? And we have an article. The title is, Should You Get Vaccinated for COVID-19? Yes. Will it protect you from long COVID? Probably not. So, spoiler alert, the vaccine is good, probably will help to keep you out of the hospital in that first month. But we need to stop thinking about COVID just as a disease of that acute phase in the first 2 or 3 weeks. It has effects. Long COVID typically lasts for about 12 months. Some of the effects can last longer than that as well. So we have a number of other articles about long COVID in this video, again, to get people to understand the risk of COVID is not just, dying of the pneumonia in the first 3 weeks or something like that, but increased risk of heart attacks, problems with long COVID in kids, including increased risk of both types, 1 and 2, of diabetes, other questions about long COVID, including more evidence for the idea of what causes long COVID. There are a number of proposed mechanisms for how the long COVID symptoms manifest. Some of it is just disease that it takes the body a while to heal from, that is incurred during that first month. Some of it, though, may be due to viral persistence, an ongoing low-level or medium-level infection with the virus that continues to cause inflammation. COVID is very good at causing inflammation in a number of ways in major organs, such as the brain, the heart, the lungs, the liver, kidneys, the gut, immune system, cardiovascular system, on and on. So that's primarily what we're going to be talking about in this video, going in depth with about half a dozen articles on that. And then just to tease, we still have at least 3 videos coming up, 2 about COVID and T cells. There's enough information about COVID and the immune system, particularly T cells, that we want to dive into that in probably 2 whole videos. And then another video about other COVID topics, including how COVID is probably being spread by keeping the schools open, how to fight some of the spread, including through the use of elastomeric masks, and how we could change the medical systems to be better prepared for this by using a system such as Medicare for All. So those are going to be in upcoming videos next week. But for now, let's turn back to this current event that popped up, Biden getting COVID, and the propaganda being put out by the Biden administration and a lot of the medical establishment generally. Just had an interaction with somebody on social media last night who claimed to be an MD, MPH per bio, and they had a Medium account, and it looked like they probably are a medical doctor and master of public health, saying, I feel like this quote sums it up, every life is precious, but that is not an exaggeration. That's basically the approach to this pandemic. It's like, sure. Yeah, life's precious, but, we got other priorities. Anyway, so this first thing crossed my desk when a tweet from Myra Batchelder came up in my feed. It said, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain tweeting out gaslighting op-ed by Leana 1 about how getting COVID is inevitable and how we should just let everyone get it is horrific. It ignores long COVID. It ignores that most don't have access to medical care like the president does. And it ignores the risks to the vulnerable. Now, on the subject of being vulnerable, Biden is 79 years old. COVID is not usually kind to people who are nearing 80 years of age. Even if you have the best medical care, it's not going to make you any healthier. Let's put it that way. Biden is frail. He probably will survive, but how much more wear and tear can that guy take? Anyway, so here's the tweet from Ron Klain, multimillionaire, longtime Democratic Party operative Ron Klain. A teaching moment in the president's diagnosis introduces us to this Washington Post op-ed. So the title is Biden's COVID diagnosis is a teaching moment for the country. Is it now? Let's read. President Biden's COVID-19 diagnosis is an opportunity for his administration to demonstrate the success of his leadership on the pandemic and what living with the coronavirus looks like. Well, for, over 1 million people, there was no living with the coronavirus. There was dying from the coronavirus. And for tens of millions of other people, there is being disabled. There's another story that we're going to do in this video about a woman in Canada who is applying for medically assisted suicide because she can no longer work because of long COVID. It's, as she says, exclusively a financial consideration. So, introducing some class analysis here, the way that the president of the United States is able to cope with COVID is not the same as the way that the average person is going to have to. Anyway, the fact that Biden contracted the coronavirus should not be surprising at all. People around him have been getting infected for months, including Vice President Harris, multiple cabinet secretaries, Pelosi, Schumer, etc. Frankly, I'm surprised he had held off infection for so long, given the number of public events he has attended and his proclivity for hugging and shaking hands. She's forgetting something. Yeah, I'm not surprised either that he got it, given that absolutely nothing is being done to control the spread of the virus, which is absolutely what we need to do. We need to end transmission. That is the only way that the pandemic is likely to end anytime soon. So far, it's just been getting worse. We've been having bigger and bigger waves, not smaller ones. All right. Biden's symptoms so far are mild, and they will likely stay that way. Wow. So she just really knows it all. First of all, we're taking the White House at their word that the symptoms are mild. Maybe they are. Maybe they aren't. Somebody was tweeting that they'll bet that Biden doesn't even have COVID. It's just an opportunity to basically gaslight the public into, trying to role model just toughing it out and working through having COVID. Everyone I have heard from recently who has told me that they had COVID said it was kicking their ass like nothing they have ever experienced before. That they've had it for 8, 9, 10 days now, that they've just been sick and sick and sick for over a week. So, this increasingly insistent tone that everything's fine, it increasingly smacks of desperation. But continuing. His age is a risk factor, you think, but he is vaccinated and twice boosted, meaning that he is very well protected against severe illness, but not against long COVID. Biden also received the antiviral pill Paxlovid right after his diagnosis. When taken early in the course of illness, Paxlovid further reduces the risk of hospitalization and death by about 90%. Now that is true. One of the problems with Paxlovid is the rebound. A lot of people will take Paxlovid. It will basically make them test negative for a while, and then they go off the, I believe, 5-day course of Paxlovid, and then it bounces back. The virus comes back for some period of time where they may become contagious again. So problems with Paxlovid, but yes, this is true. Can everyone get Paxlovid? Well, the medical system in the United States is such that not everyone has a primary care provider. So there are a number of problems. Anyway, Biden, his medical team, and others in the administration have done all the right things to demonstrate what should happen after a COVID diagnosis. If you're the president, I guess, which does not apply to a lot of people. Right after Biden tested positive, his staff canceled public events. He entered isolation, and White House staff near him were cut to the minimum number. The administration began reaching out to those with whom he had exposure so that they can follow precautions and get tested. Yeah, but again, the problem is just letting people get sick. You can't just keep this as your policy because, again, COVID is not just a threat during the acute period. There is a risk to around 20% of people who get COVID of developing long COVID. Continuing, it's also notable that Biden has been receiving regular tests, with the last negative test reported on Tuesday, 2 days before his positive test Thursday morning. That means that his infection was caught quickly. Okay, but let's apply this standard to the rest of the country. How many places are doing regular routine testing? Are they doing it at colleges? Where are they doing this regular routine testing where people are catching their infections quickly? There are the rapid tests now, but a lot of people are not necessarily going to be using those on a regular basis. They're also a lot less reliable. So a lot of problems here. Pretty much everywhere that there were sort of weekly testing requirements, those have been lifted. Why? For evidence-based reasons? No. Just people got tired of dealing with it. Didn't want to see the cases anymore. Like, whatever it is, it's not really being done the way that this would have been done last year, for example. But despite being important, actually, she continues, this is important for two reasons, but it isn't really being done anymore. First, it allows for more precise and timely contact tracing. Remember contact tracing? Again, this stuff has just been abandoned, basically. Second, it enables antiviral treatment to begin rapidly. The sooner a person takes Paxlovid, the more effective it will be in stopping virus replication and curbing the progression to severe disease. These are all important lessons for Americans, okay, which are not being supported at a structural level. Biden should use his illness as an opportunity to inform the public that COVID-19 is a manageable disease for almost everyone, except for the 1 million people who have died and the tens of millions who are disabled and unable to work, unable to do basic life activities anymore, so long as they use the tools available to them. It's crucial to test as soon as someone develops symptoms, and if they're positive, to isolate right away. Of course, we know that the CDC has been cutting down those requirements on the isolating and quarantining. Let people that they've exposed know that they should take necessary precautions, then take advantage of available treatments. The earlier the better. Don't wait until symptoms become severe to initiate Paxlovid. This is really written like someone who has no recent experience with trying to manage a job, a family, all the kinds of routine stuff, doing your laundry, like all the things that you need to do when you're living paycheck to paycheck, as 2/3 of the country does. Believe it or not, people who work as dishwashers and parking attendants and janitors do not have Secret Service and, presidential aides following them around with clipboards, attending to their every need. Anyway, another key lesson is that it's inevitable that everyone, even the President of the United States, will be exposed to the coronavirus. And she's correct in that, but she's leaving out, again, the crucial part, because we are not doing anything to contain it. And that's the only reason that that sentence is true. It's inevitable that everyone will be exposed to it if we don't curb transmission, which we could do, but which the needs of capital conflict with. And they have enough political power to override the medical reality that we do need to curb transmission. We need to stop it. Otherwise, the pandemic could go on for a very long time, and the human toll is going to be incalculable. As it is, the amount of people who are going to be developing long COVID or already have it is going to be requiring an amount of medical care that the system is just simply not I mean, the already troubled system is not going to be able to step up and do, not even close. So just mass suffering, that's what they're talking about. And again, why? She doesn't mention it. She doesn't even talk about the fact that they have walked away from trying to control transmission. Continuing. That's why vaccination and boosters are so important. So again, I got vaccinated and I got a booster shot. I'm not old enough to qualify for the second one, though I hope that by the fall or winter, when this thing is probably going to get crazy again and my booster will have completely worn off, that, they will expand the eligibility. Because I don't think that going through the winter with like zero COVID protection and a much more severe virus is going to be, just insanely stressful on top of fucking everything else that you have to deal with. But yeah, it's basically like we're blowing up the airplane. Everyone make sure to wear a parachute. Like you need that last line of defense because there are no other lines of defense. The vaccines are key in the event that you get infected. But you can't just have a strategy of like everyone gets infected. They're a last line of defense, not a first line of defense. You want to prevent infection in the first place, and they're not even trying. So remember the conversation about increasing ventilation and air filtration? Yeah, that went out in about 3 months. It was discussed, it was proposed, it was rejected, ignored, shut down, and forgotten about. That's how quickly this came in and went out. And all the right-wingers that are like, oh, it's the New World Order, they want a vaccine passport, control your whole life. Was that realistic, or is what we were saying more realistic? That they're going to just throw the working class to the wolves and just basically like toss us into the churning gears of profit. So anyway, Biden needs to keep emphasizing that he's doing well, assuming that he is, right? Because reality matters, at least to some of us, because he is up to date on vaccines. The fact that he contracted the coronavirus doesn't mean that the vaccines don't work. Rather, it means that you're not doing any transmission control. That's what it means. Rather, vaccines succeeded because they're keeping him out of the hospital. Or are they? We don't know. But they don't keep everyone out of the hospital. But we don't talk about that, do we? No, she doesn't mention it. And let's remember also, hospitalization usually occurs in week 2 or 3. So it's a lagging indicator. The rough order of indicators is wastewater, then test results, or, the case count, which is badly muddled by politics and which cases they count and which don't get counted, then hospitalizations, then death. And they're each separated by 4 or 5 days to a week. This next one is a real mind blower. She says Biden can also message that those who wish to prolong the period until they get the coronavirus can use additional measures such as masking in indoor spaces and testing before gathering inside. She doesn't even mention masking outdoors, which with BA5 you have to do. This is, forget the old rules. This is a new virus at this point. But she is declaring everyone is going to get this thing. She said it's literally only a matter of time. Those who wish to prolong it. I'm sorry, I don't ever want it. This is unacceptable. You're killing and disabling people. That's what you're doing. I got long COVID. It made all of 2021 virtually unbearable for me. I don't want that again. And I don't want anyone else to get it either. This is insane policy. And she's not stating why. Why aren't they doing anything to control transmission? Because big business needs people to keep working and spending, or else the system collapses. Well, capitalism is asking you to die. Are you willing to die so that capitalism can live? Because that is what it's about. Capitalism, if it slows down at all, this is the same reason that capitalism has to invade country after country for resources and labor. That's why, and to open markets and all the stuff that it does as it expands into country after country after country. It has to do that or it collapses, it dies. So that's the basic proposition being put up here, although it's not being framed as a choice. You die so capitalism can live. You risk yourself so that capitalists keep running the system, which, by the way, is just going to get more unstable and more unstable. It's destroying the earth. The contradictions of capitalism are causing climate change. They're going to be causing widespread famines very soon. See a Prol Cult video that I just linked to in the community tab for that. But no, they just make it out like, well, this is the only course of action. Well, no, it isn't. And that's why we're doing this channel here. Anyway, continuing. No doubt these practices are what kept Biden from being infected until now. Still, the fact that he contracted the virus, despite all these precautions, speaks to how contagious emerging variants are and how difficult, if not impossible, avoiding COVID-19 has become. Again, let's add the rest of the sentence. When there are no precautionary measures being taken at a structural level, they are not protecting us from this disease. They made a big deal about this in the first year, and then as soon as it started to really cost capital anything, they started to sweep it under the rug and try to make us believe that none of it ever existed. Continuing, getting the coronavirus should not come with stigma or be perceived as a failure. It is a fucking failure. It's not a personal failure. It's a failure of the goddamn system. This is a murderous system. That's what it is. And it's a failure of the system. And we need to end this fucking system now. Rather, it should reflect the new normal going forward. If you think that people getting regularly infected 2 or 3 times a year with a disabling, crippling virus is some kind of that's a sustainable basis for a society, you've been drinking the Kool-Aid too long. I don't know what her paycheck for saying this shit looks like, but she is completely detached from reality at this point. I don't know how you could possibly believe these words as an MD. I mean, the new normal, it's going to completely not just cripple individuals, but it's going to cripple the entire economy. Already, you go to supermarkets and it's like a third of the shelves are empty still. You know, this is, quote, supply chain disruptions. That is going to get worse, not better. You know, are socialists ready to agitate, educate, and organize? Because it does not seem like it to me. Capitalism is about to shit the bed in a major way. If socialists don't use this opportunity to make major gains so that we can put this system down once and for all, then I don't know what to tell you. You know, I had people telling me in comments of like, why should, you know, socialist organizations care about this anymore? Nobody cares. Why should we have protests? Because we're supposed to be providing evidence-based leadership politically to working people. That's why. Do you think that people are overwhelmingly happy with the situation? Biden's poll numbers started tanking at the exact time that he declared the pandemic over as Delta was coming in. They have not gone up since then. Now, that's not the only thing going on in the country, but it was one of the more significant things that was happening at that time. If you look at who supports the Democratic Party, something like 90% of black voters support Democrats, including Biden. I mean, he's a Democrat at least. And we did a story in a previous COVID update about support for the mask mandate on public transportation and airplanes. And it was broken down by race and ethnicity. Older conservative white people were the most hostile to mask mandates, and the most desiring of mask mandates were African American. So, you know, this is not something that overwhelmingly working class people are happy about, this overall situation, being put in harm's way because, you know, it's just time to go back to work. This is not popular policy, and for good reason. People know, it's common sense, there is this disease still going around. And most people by now know at least somebody who has had some kind of severe consequences from it. But it gets worse. She continues, indeed, this is almost certainly not the only time Biden will get the coronavirus. again, how many times do you think a 79-year-old who is as frail as Biden is can withstand something like that, even with the Paxlovid and everything? Biden, like the rest of us, could contract the virus once a year or more. This is completely ignoring long COVID. It is completely ignoring long COVID. The CDC does not, they don't really do anything about it, but they do not completely ignore long COVID. They don't take it as seriously as they should, obviously. But this isn't some fringe theory. But to her, it doesn't exist. It's not worth mentioning. What if Biden's illness progresses to become more serious? It's possible that he starts experiencing fever and body aches, and he could develop a lingering cough and other longer-term symptoms. It's unlikely, though also not impossible, that he could even... so she's really covering her bases here. That he could even become ill enough to require hospitalization. These are still opportunities for him to showcase his leadership. This is fucking insane. That's about the best word that I can come up, the most accurate word I can use to describe this. This is insane, this article. These are still opportunities for him to showcase his leadership and values by being honest and transparent with the American people. At that point, the only way he could really be honest and transparent with the U.S. American people is by saying, hey, I put a guy named Jeff Zients from Bain Capital with no medical or public health experience in charge of the COVID-19 response. This was a major failure. I am deeply sorry to all the people who died and got sick and disabled. Our policy has been a complete failure, and we're going to change it going forward. That would be being honest and transparent. But you're not going to see that. You're not going to see it. Not unless, literally, we take to the streets again like we did in 2020, but I don't know what it's going to take to light a fire under people in the United States at this point. Finally, we saw some protest marches down in Uvalde, Texas, after cops sat around while 20 kids got murdered at school. It seems like just Americans sit around and just will take anything. You can just kick Americans in the face over and over and over again, and they just won't stand up. I have never been able to understand this for the 20 years that I have been following politics. It's like any kind of a protest movement at all, anti-war or otherwise, is just nearly dead. You get little flare-ups here and there, barely anything sustained. It's despicable. Stand the fuck up for yourselves. Have some self-respect. It's scary, I know, but it starts with one step, and then the second step gets easier as you build some goddamn courage, grow a backbone. Continuing. For now, Biden's back at work and carrying out all the duties of his office. That's exactly as it should be. No, that's the exact opposite of what you should do if you should get COVID. Don't go to work. Don't work through it. When people get sick, they need to relax and rest and take care of themselves, or they risk prolonging the illness and possibly kicking it into a higher, more severe stage. You need to rest. You need time off of work when you get sick. This is the exact opposite of what a fucking doctor of all people should be putting out in a national newspaper. Thanks in large part to Biden's leadership. What leadership? Over the past 2 years, the United States has had so much success with vaccines and treatments that even when the president gets the virus... What do you mean, even when the president? He has access to stuff that none of the rest of us have. It's business as usual. And those are the closing words of the article. That's basically her main thesis. My closing words? Fuck you. Perhaps punctuated with a Molotov cocktail. So, that's the Life is Precious But opening of the video. Let's now get into our first main article of this COVID-19 update. This one's from Forbes, William A. Haseltine. You'll recognize that name if you've been listening to our COVID-19 updates. He does good sciencey COVID articles. For Forbes, more danger ahead with BA5. COVID-19 reinfection doubles the risk for death, blood clots, and lung damage. So, contrary to this notion that we should all just get COVID once or twice or 3 times a year, Getting reinfected doubles these risks. Okay? This is actual medical research. This is dated July 13, 2022. Caption there is, "We need to take action now to prevent reinfections and ensure that they do not cause long-term problems." All right. A recent preprint, that's a study that has not fully completed peer review yet. A recent preprint concludes that 2 or more COVID-19 reinfections double the risk for death, blood clots, and lung damage, among other negative health outcomes, demonstrating the clear and present danger of reinfection. The most recent Omicron variants have an enhanced capacity to evade our innate immune defenses. BA4 and BA5 are continuing that trend, with replication of the subvariants associated with reduced activation of epithelial innate immune responses compared to earlier BA1, that was Omicron, and BA2 subvariants. So what is the epithelial innate immune response? So epithelium is basically lining. SARS coronavirus 2 is not exclusively a respiratory virus. It affects a lot more than your respiratory system. However, it is often transmitted via the respiratory system. So the epithelium is like the lining, basically. And so that's where the virus is coming into contact with. And what they're noting is that BA4 and BA5 do not activate your immune response as much as the earlier variants. So the virus gets in there, and your immune system just doesn't do as much with it, basically. Continuing, with BA5 responsible for over 54% of all COVID infections, and BA4 accounting for over 17%, also these are very closely related variants, the risk of reinfection is especially high even for those who were more recently infected with BA1 or BA2, which of course was just in the last 6 months or 3 months, whatever. We need to take action now to prevent reinfections and ensure that they do not cause long-term health impacts for broad swaths of the population. You can see there a chart, this is from the CDC's Nowcast, of the different variants going extinct and coming into dominance. This is the first study to characterize the health risks of reinfection, an understudied area. The CDC uses the health records of more than 5.6 million people treated in the Veterans Affairs, VA, health system. The study population was broken down into 257,427 participants who had one documented SARS coronavirus 2 infection and 38,926 participants who had 2 or more SARS coronavirus 2 reinfections, and then 5.4 million participants with no record of positive SARS coronavirus 2 infection as a control group. Among those who experienced reinfection, 36,417 people had 2 infections, 2,263 people had 3 infections, and 246 people had 4 or more infections. The median time between the first and second infection was 79 days, and between the second and third was 65 days. So if we can learn anything from that just there, obviously the study findings continue. The median time between that first infection and the second infection was less than 3 months, 79 days, about 2.5 months. And between the second and third was even shorter, just over 2 months, 65 days. So, you know, as far as like, I have natural immunity. No, there's people getting reinfected less than 3 months later, and that's the median time. So anyway, the authors found those with 2 or more documented infections had more than double the risk of dying and 3 times the risk of being hospitalized within 6 months of their last infection. They also had higher risks for lung and heart problems, cardiovascular disorders, coagulation, and hematologic disorders, fatigue, digestive and kidney disorders, diabetes, musculoskeletal disorders, mental health disorders, and neurologic problems as represented in Figure 2 below, not yet on the screen. The risks were most pronounced in the acute phase, yet most were still evident at 6 months after reinfection. So what are they saying here? It's that if you had 2 or more documented infections, you had more than double the risk of dying and then 3 times the risk of being hospitalized within 6 months of their last infection. So they said that this is most pronounced in the acute phase. That's the first, 2 to 4 weeks of the infection, but it's still evident at 6 months. In other words, people are still having health problems that seem to be brought about by this, an increased risk of health problems manifesting 6 months out. So this is what we keep saying is if you get hospitalized with COVID, you don't come out of the hospital feeling like $1 million. You come out of the hospital barely surviving. It does a lot of damage to your body. Like the fact that you got hospitalized, that it was that severe, it's doing immense damage to your vital organs, inflammation throughout your body. And then even if you survive that, you're coming out of it worse for wear. That's the point. As represented by double the risk of dying and 3 times the risk of being hospitalized. So, again, it shows up most in the acute phase, but that risk of dying, it extends out to 6 months. We covered this, I believe, in a live stream earlier. Basically, there was a study from Estonia, same kind of thing, population health study. They looked at vast amounts of medical records, and they found that people who had a COVID infection, that wasn't a study on reinfection, it was just a study on the first infection. They found that people who got COVID, even once, were more likely to die within the next calendar year out from that infection. So now, if you add in reinfection, those odds go up even more. So this whole thing of like, oh, everybody's going to get COVID twice a year, that's going to last about 5 years, and then everyone over about 55 is going to be fucking dead. Might be a slight exaggeration, but that is going to add up quickly. It shaves years off your life. That's what we're learning. So anyway, figure 2 is on the screen. You can see that the green line, this is broken down into different categories: hospitalization, risk, at least one sequela, which is sequelae are consequences, or sequelae are consequences, medical consequences of a condition. Then there's cardiovascular, then coagulation and hematologic problems, diabetes, fatigue, gastrointestinal, kidney, mental health, musculoskeletal, neurologic, and pulmonary. That's lung diseases. So you can see there, the green is people who had 1 infection, orange is people who had 2 infections, and purple, people who had 3 or more infections. It is consistent across all groups. The more reinfections you get, the higher your risk, period. There is no exception. Even if you survive COVID, and obviously people who got reinfected, survived the first one, otherwise they wouldn't have been around to get reinfected. It's taking a toll on your body every time. So when they just say, live with COVID, get COVID, it's mild, bro, it's cool, just catch COVID. No, it's shaving years off your life, and it's making you more likely to get pretty serious diseases. Continuing the article, many leaders within the US and globally have currently opted for more relaxed or even non-existent COVID-19 policies, relying on vaccines to reduce the risk of death and hospitalization. The New York City Department of Health recently removed its color-coded COVID-19 alert system from the website, stating that they were reevaluating the system, a move that seemed to contradict the rising case counts and current 7-day positivity rate of 14%. So yeah, we covered that in a live stream. The New York City Department of Health, literally as BA5 was just starting to surge, removed their COVID alert system. Coincidence? I mean, they're trying to bury this thing. That's why we need to cover it. We need to speak up. We need mass demonstrations. Anyway, in the face of rising case counts, which again are heavily manipulated, specifically in the undercounting direction, and this disturbing new data, or these disturbing new data on reinfection, it would be foolish to rely purely on medical interventions such as vaccines and antiviral drugs alone. Comment: remember, vaccines and antiviral drugs, those are your last lines of defense. Vaccine is a bit preventative. It's in case you get infected. You can do that beforehand. The antiviral drugs are after the fact. You've already been infected, etc. We need to do a lot more to be proactive about stopping transmission. Anyway, while there may be little appetite left for measures like lockdowns and social distancing, there's still plenty we can do to reduce transmission and the overall health burden of the virus. Reducing transmission is the only way to slow down viral evolution and prevent more deadly and immune-evading variants. issuing N95 masks freed the entire population, reinstating mask mandates, and installing proper ventilation and filtration, HEPA filters, in schools and workplaces, I feel like you'd be more likely to get shutdowns than that, honestly. Like, the kind of construction required for that, I just don't know. Not that it couldn't be done, but the infantile whining about, just business freedom, etc., this has gotta end. Obviously, we have a government that's run by the biggest, business criminals in the world, the mafia, basically. And the minute that it costs them anything, they don't want to do anything. The minute that it interferes at all with profit, they don't want to do anything. I kind of feel like a shutdown would be more likely than installing ventilation, but I don't know. What do you think? Continuing, along with carbon dioxide monitors are just a few non-invasive measures that we can take to reduce transmission. So what are the carbon dioxide monitors about? That basically measures how much fresh air you have. If the air is very stale, you're going to have higher CO2. So that can kind of tell you if you need to get better ventilation in a room. We also need consistent local and national data reporting and free PCR testing and rapid tests for all, regardless of insurance status, so that individuals can make well-informed choices about their own levels of risk. So this guy's usually good. We cannot be using phrases like well-informed choices about their own levels of risk. Leave that to the propagandists. There's too much of that. Again, I like William Haseltine's work, but leave phrases like that to the propagandists. You know that they're going to be putting them out. We need to be calling for public health measures, not well-informed choices about your own level of risk. We need mask mandates back, and we need them now. We need them in a very big way. So I think that the U.S.'s attitude toward the pandemic, literally just la la la, ostrich, stick your head in the sand, pretend it's not there, is most evident with the mask mandate, because mask mandates are minimally invasive. They cost very little to anyone. There's no shutdown involved. You don't have to have construction to have like a ventilation and filtration system put in. It is much more individual. It's on the individual to do it. And yet they won't do that either. So that to me speaks to there's like a really, really deep ideological resistance. They really just want people believing everything's fine. Again, because it's just, that's not even like so much of a material issue, except for you could say that there's the psychological impact of just having people being reminded that, oh God, there's a problem. And hey, the government's not really doing anything about it. They want to sweep the works under the rug and just have as few reminders of it as possible. Full hospital. I was reading all kinds of stuff, like somebody had to get an entire blood transfusion in the ER because every single hospital bed was full with COVID patients at a hospital. As far as the PCR testing, I was just hearing from somebody that their state just wrapped up all their PCR testing. So if you want to get a PCR test now, it's like $120. So used to be, when they were taking the pandemic more seriously, people were having mandatory PCR tests. We were talking about that earlier, where it was like you would either be vaccinated or you would have to submit to a weekly test. And that's all gone. Again, the right wing got everything that they wanted out of this. Everything. And still they complain. But anyway, this is where we're at. So reinfection, very, very bad. If you get infected 2 or 3 times, particularly if you're older, you probably, I would say, have lost 10 or 15 years off your life. Just a rough guess. We don't know yet. We don't have all the statistics yet on the medium term. But looking at the ways that it increases your risk of serious diseases do not extend your life. Let's put it that way. So let's do a Haseltine twofer. And a lot of people have actually asked about this one. It's the question of, does the vaccine prevent long COVID? This is the article. Should you get vaccinated for COVID-19? Yes. Will it protect you from long COVID? Probably not. This is dated July 14, 2022. The United States is amidst a new COVID-19 wave. BA 2.12.1, the previous variant of concern, has been outcompeted by highly transmissible Omicron subvariants BA 4 and BA 5. Quick timeout. Just reflecting on this, I want to just underline heavily really point out, really emphasize, the pandemic response is in free fall. There is no plan. There are going to be new variants all the time, out competing each other, reinfecting people. There is simply no plan. This system will persist for as long as we tolerate it, and honestly, I don't know why people are still tolerating it, but continuing. BA4 and 5 contribute 16 and 65% respectively to the 110,000 plus COVID-19 cases seen daily, a conservative estimate considering that at-home testing results are not included. And infection rates are forecasted to rise. These two variants are more likely than BA2.12.1 to lead to vaccine breakthrough infections. As a result, even persons who are up to date on vaccines or who recently recovered from COVID-19, quote, natural immunity, are susceptible to reinfection and all the health risks that brings with it, as we just covered. It is unknown if BA4 and 5 cause less severity of disease than their predecessors. Doesn't look that way. What is known is that while vaccination does not protect against infection, it does seem to successfully prevent hospitalizations and deaths. Latest CDC statistics show a 3.1% uptick in hospitalization rates, averaging over 5,700 hospitalizations a week. The current 7-day moving average of new deaths, 273, actually decreased 21% from the previous week. Although this level of hospitalization and death is still unacceptable, it is comparatively modest compared to prior waves. And let me just comment there. Again, we are in summer. This is the time of year when people are least likely to die of any cause. And it's because, again, the weather's warmer. It's more friendly to the body. People are getting more sunshine. Vitamin D levels are higher. There are a lot of things that are conducive to better health overall. I'm not totally shocked by that. I think if the exact same conditions were happening in the winter, people's health is just more fragile in the winter. Anyway, continuing. With 78.4% of the U.S. population protected with at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, 67% fully vaccinated. That's one of the lowest rates of any comparable country. I mean, you look anywhere, Cuba, China, France, anywhere, most places are way more than 67% fully vaccinated. And 47.9% boosted. Less than half got the third shot. The widespread adoption of vaccines has likely dampened the increase in observed rates. Vaccination and long COVID. The consequences for COVID-19 may appear mild, but each infection has the risk of developing serious post-COVID complications, otherwise known as long COVID or COVID long haulers or whatever. There are several circulating definitions for long COVID. In my book, A Family Guide to Long COVID, Questions and Answers, I define long COVID broadly to highlight several long-term complications, such as organ damage caused by acute COVID-19. More generally, it's characterized by a heterogeneous collection of symptoms, heterogeneous is mixed basically, which arise after SARS-CoV-2 infection has cleared and linger for a long time. Fatigue, shortness of breath, and brain fog are commonly reported symptoms. And again, brain fog comes from brain damage, which, depending on severity, can intensely disrupt daily life for months or more. Current COVID-19 vaccines prevent hospitalization and death. Do they also prevent long COVID? A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association confirms an existing observation that vaccination provides little protection against developing long COVID. This study observed 739 Italian healthcare workers who had COVID-19 but were not hospitalized for it. 229 individuals from this group had long COVID. So that's about 31%. This is usually what we see. You see estimates from 10% to 30%. I think about 10% of the people have officially gotten the post-COVID unspecified diagnosis, but the reported rate is much higher, 20 to 30%. So that makes sense. The authors defined long COVID as any SARS-CoV-2 related symptom which lasted more than 4 weeks. Individuals with asymptomatic COVID-19, so you had no symptoms in the upfront acute phase, were included in the 739-member cohort, although they could not, by the study standards, develop long COVID. Note that asymptomatic cases have been observed to lead to long COVID beyond the scope of the study. So, quick timeout. Why? Because they're defining it as a symptom which lasted more than 4 weeks, meaning you got it during the acute phase and then it lasted beyond that. But we know that people with asymptomatic COVID can get long COVID, like you get the infection, you don't have symptoms, but then you get symptoms like starting 3 months in. That would be asymptomatic acute plus development of long COVID. This study was measuring it differently. So anyway, continuing, all healthcare workers completed surveys, which included a list of SARS coronavirus 2 symptoms and their duration, along with vaccination status. And they were tested every 1 to 2 weeks for positive SARS coronavirus 2 results. Some of the symptoms mentioned are fatigue, loss of concentration, shortness of breath, and problems sleeping. From the survey results, the authors found that the number of vaccine doses was associated with lower long COVID prevalence. Unvaccinated healthcare workers reported a 41.8% incidence of long COVID. Those with 1 dose reported 30%. Patients with 2 doses reported a 17.4% incidence, and those with 3 reported 16%. According to these results, vaccines can only reduce one's chances of getting long COVID by about 24 or 25% at best, and only if the individual is fully vaccinated and or boosted. All administered doses in this study were of Pfizer's BNT 162b2 vaccine. So you can see that in the graph there. Basically, the impact has maxed out at 3 doses. You get a very diminished return between the second and the third dose. Basically, if you get 2 doses, you are down to about 17%. You get a third dose, maybe it's going to give you an extra percent, but that's about it. I mean, it's a significant reduction versus people who are not vaccinated. Why is that? Could be that unvaccinated people are much more likely to be hospitalized, and we know that people who are hospitalized during the acute phase are overrepresented in the long COVID group. In other words, being hospitalized greatly increases your odds, like I would say roughly double, of getting long COVID. So there may be a link there in the unvaccinated group. Then you get 1 dose, shaves off about 10-12% of your chances, and then 2 doses more so, and that's about the best that you can do. So basically your odds wind up being, even with the full vaccination, about 1 in 6 of getting long COVID. Not great odds. Now that's going to be different by age group. We covered that in the last long COVID update, so there are different parameters to work with there. Overall, though, 1 in 6 odds are not terrific when we're talking about, potentially really debilitating symptoms. Continuing, these data supplement findings by a study of U.S. veterans, which saw a 15% reduction of long COVID after vaccination. The scale of the veteran study was much larger. However, the age skewed towards older people and included a low number of women, only 8 to 10%. This is an important distinction, as women are more likely to develop long COVID symptoms compared to men. The 2 studies suggest that vaccination can reduce one's chances of long COVID, but the protection gained is not strong. Individuals with at least 2 vaccine doses may benefit slightly from this correlation. Is it worth getting vaccinated? Ultimately, should you still get vaccinated and boosted? Generally, yes. Vaccination is essential to reducing one's chances of hospitalization and death, particularly as there is no control on transmission. So the virus is all around you. Yes, I would personally recommend stocking up on whatever can reduce the odds of this thing hurting you. However, if you're looking to get boosted to avoid long COVID, it's best to temper expectations. Recent studies suggest that current COVID-19 vaccines offer meager protection from long COVID. The best means of avoiding long COVID will be, basically not to catch it, to use preventative measures as needed, such as mask wearing and social distancing, to prevent getting COVID-19 to begin with. And of course, this flies in the face of the current U.S. strategy, which is everybody get COVID, preferably more than once, preferably every year. So, let's look now at some of the specifics of what long COVID actually looks like and the impact that it has on people. We've covered a number of studies and articles about long COVID, but there's always new research coming out. So here's an article. Long COVID has over 200 symptoms and leaves 1 in 5 unable to work, study finds. Yeah, that sounds sustainable. This is by Robert Hart, And this is an older article. This is from 1 year ago, July 16, 2021. So this has been known for a while. This is a study that was published by that point, so the research was already done. And, this is what we're swimming in today. So let's review. We've done a lot of articles and studies regarding long COVID. Here is yet another one. So, top line. There are more than 200 symptoms associated with long COVID spanning 10 organ systems, including memory loss, hallucinations, tremors, and fatigue, according to a new study published Thursday, providing one of the most comprehensive insights yet into the lingering and debilitating illness that can affect patients for months or years after infection. Key facts. COVID long haulers reported a total of 203 different symptoms in the 7 months between December 2019 and May 2020, ranging from rashes, peeling skin, and digestive issues, to muscle spasms, hearing loss, and tinnitus, according to research published in the Lancet's eClinical Medicine journal. The study, based on surveys from nearly 4,000 people from 56 countries, identified fatigue, brain fog, read brain damage, and post-exertional malaise, where symptoms worsen after physical or mental effort, as the most common symptoms. On average, patients suffered from 56 different symptoms, and those still suffering after 6 months, nearly 2/3 of participants taking the survey, were still experiencing an average of 14 symptoms. Almost half, 45%, of the study's participants reported needing a reduced work schedule on account of their illness, and more than 1 out of 5, 22%, was unable to work at all. Dr. Athena Akrami, a neuroscientist at University College London and senior author of the study, said that it highlights, quote, a clear need to widen medical guidelines to assess a wider range of symptoms than respiratory and cardiovascular issues for long COVID. So again, this has been known, published, research for over a year. What are they doing instead? They're wrapping up the pandemic response as this disease continues to rage. Surprising fact, the researchers noted that patients reported experiencing symptoms that are, quote, not commonly mentioned in public discussion of long COVID, like seizures. Actually, we had a commenter talking about that, having seizures. They've never had seizures before in their life, but they have since getting COVID. That's extremely serious. So seizures, suicidality, facial paralysis, new allergies, and changes in sensitivities to medication. Key background. The findings reinforce the understanding that COVID-19 is far more than a respiratory illness, and it has an effect on the entire body. It also highlights that some symptoms may only emerge after months or weeks of the initial infection. Severity of the initial infection does not appear to be strongly linked to the chances of getting long COVID, making children and young people, along with the unvaccinated, especially vulnerable. So let's say that again. Severity of the initial infection does not appear to be strongly linked to the chances of getting long COVID. So we know that hospitalization does seem to raise the odds. But beyond that, whether you have asymptomatic, mild, or moderate symptoms, your odds of getting long COVID are about the same. And as we just covered in the last article, the vaccines will reduce your odds to a point, but they'll only lower it to about 1 out of 6, something like that. Given that the majority of early research only covered hospitalized patients and the continued lack of consistent diagnostic criteria, it's not yet known how common long COVID might be. Studies suggest around 10 to 30% of COVID-19 patients may go on to become these, quote, long haulers, though this figure is likely to change as more research is conducted. Well, actually, that's still pretty consistent with what we know today a year later. What we don't know. There's also no sense yet of the duration of long COVID. The researchers estimated more than 90% of the cohorts studied to still experience symptoms after 6 months. Yeah, from what we know now, this is more like a 12-month, maybe longer situation for many people. I mean, in my own case, I had the fatigue and shortness of breath and brain fog. Definitely, those are like the 3 most common symptoms. I had the I'd say the fatigue went first. I probably had that for 4 or 5 months, something like that, at least to where it was like really pronounced. The shortness of breath, I feel like maybe that was 9 months where it was really significant. And the brain fog was close to a year. Now, I've had other stuff too that it's been more like a year and a half now, and some of it is still not totally resolved. I feel the most normal that I have felt so far, but yeah, it was completely debilitating for quite a while. So anyway, other post-infection syndromes can vary from weeks to decades in duration, some only manifesting long after the initial infection is cleared. Dr. David Strain, a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter, told Forbes that the nearest illness to long COVID is probably chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as ME, which can last decades. Big number, 33.9 million. That's how many people in the U.S. have had COVID-19, according to data from Johns Hopkins University. So, updating, that number is now between 89 million and 90 million. So, that's where we're at now. Using a conservative estimate of 10% for how many people go on to develop long COVID and subtracting how many have died from COVID-19, that's 3.3 million Americans who could be living with persistent, debilitating symptoms. So, just a comment on that, we know that more than 10% get long COVID for sure. So, subtracting the million who have died, I mean, we're looking at like 9 million to 26 million people with long COVID, and then a certain percentage of those, it's going to be completely debilitating to where they can't work. So what do you think? Letting this thing spread unchecked, is it a good idea? I would say no. Closing it out, what to watch for? Akrami says that the prevalence and often hidden nature of long COVID justify a national network of dedicated clinics. Oh boy, I miss the days when we were taking this remotely seriously, to identify and treat patients suffering from the condition. There are already at least 41 hospitals offering post-COVID clinics across the U.S., according to Becker's Hospital Review. So that's the end of that article. Speaking of people working and such, let's look at an article from Canada. Content warning on this article, suicide. If you can't listen to that, just skip ahead to the next section. The description box has the timestamps. So this is an article from, 7 News in Australia about a Canadian woman. The title is, Canadian Woman Enduring Effects of Long COVID Begins Process for Medically Assisted Death. Quote, my choices are basically to die slowly and painfully or quickly. Those are the options that are left. This is from 4 days ago, and Rhiannon Lewin wrote this. Now, I want to say, you might think that this is just because the COVID is so painful. That's not the case, as we will read in the article. A Canadian woman who contracted long COVID says that her life has radically changed after experiencing the condition for 2 years, leading her to apply for voluntary euthanasia. Tracy Thompson, a Toronto resident in her 50s, she is not old, told CTV News that she has begun the process of applying for medical assistance in dying, MAID, made due to extreme fatigue and a lack of financial support. Tracy, pictured there at the bottom, who used to work as a chef, says that she's been out of work for 26 months and has no foreseeable ability to return to work. Quote, MAID is exclusively a financial consideration, she said. My choices are basically to die slowly and painfully or quickly. Those are the options that are left. So they didn't put that in the headline, but she is choosing suicide because she can no longer provide for herself because of COVID. That's what's going on. Long COVID symptoms. Thompson said in addition to severe fatigue, she has experienced a range of symptoms including blurred vision, difficulty digesting food, difficulty breathing, an altered sense of taste and smell, and scars on her heart from swelling due to myocarditis. While experts say that long COVID is difficult to diagnose, see, here's the thing about that. It's not that hard to diagnose. It's that doctors are often cocky fucks who don't listen to their patients. That is, I would say, a broad swath of the problem. Anyway, it's claimed some 5% of those who contract the virus go on to develop long-term symptoms. Whoa, is that off? It's claimed that some 5% of those who contract the virus, that is half of what we know is an overly conservative minimum. We're looking at 15 to 30%, not 5%. Probably 20 is safe. That's what the CDC, I believe, estimates. 5%. Amazing. They're trying to make it out to be some like really fringe thing. It is not. Anyway, including fatigue, shortness of breath, fever, headaches, and difficulty concentrating. And let me just add, when they say difficulty concentrating, when I had this for the first time in my life, and it's better now. I don't know if I'm fully back, but it's much better than it was. I could not hold a thought in my head for more than like 7 or 8 seconds consistently. The way I describe it is I would form the thought in my mind's eye, and then an invisible hand would yank it away after between 5 to 10 seconds. And then it would just be gone, and I would have no idea what I was thinking about. That's what it was like. I talked to somebody else leaving a comment. They said they work in a lab, and there was a really bright young scientist, and she got it, and she has to carry around a notepad right now, because if she doesn't write down all of her thoughts, she will forget them, and has a lot of difficulty following conversations now. Just that short-term memory of what were you just saying, what was I just saying. It's like it's gone. I've never had anything like that in my life. Anyway, continuing. Thompson told CTV she previously worked long hours in a physically demanding job, which anybody who's worked in a kitchen knows that is long hours in a physically demanding environment. However, she now struggles to stand up to get a glass of water. Quote, from being able-bodied and employed to basically bedbound, she said. Quote, I can't get up on average for 20-plus hours. I have very little capacity to expend the energy physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I try to stay home all the time. Let me just add again, I've mentioned this before, but the fatigue for me, what would happen to me, and this was like in the first few months, around 3 o'clock, I would just get struck with severe fatigue. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I would have to lie down on the couch. After an hour or two, I would feel like I, had a little bit of energy again. I would get up for 5 minutes and I'd have to lie down for another 2 hours. So I've had what she's talking about. It's horrendous. I'm younger than she is, so that may be a factor. But yeah, she's not old enough to retire, but too sick to work. This is crazy. But Thompson stressed that she still enjoys life and doesn't want to die, but she doesn't think she can survive without an income. Quote, I still enjoy life. Birds chirping, small things that make up a day are still pleasant to me. They're still enjoyable. I still enjoy my friends. There's a lot to enjoy in life, even if it's small, she said. But I don't relish the idea of suffering for months to come to the same conclusion. When support is not coming, things aren't going to change. It seems irrational to put myself through that just to die in the end. So this is how, most of the governments were paying people to stay home in 2020, maybe part of 2021. Canada, I think more so than the US. But now that has been rolled back. Even in the US when they were doing it, they were turning the tap on and off at different times. And this is what people were experiencing. It wasn't just that there was a shutdown. It wasn't just that small businesses were closing and people were losing their jobs. It's that people really couldn't work, and imagine being in her situation. She's not depressed, like the entire world does not seem awful to her. But she is staring down homelessness, basically just wasting away due to lack of financial support. And she'd rather die than to face that. Some of this might be psychological in the sense of she sounds like a independent woman who, if you've worked in a kitchen, a lot of people, who thrive in that kind of environment, let's say, tend to be very strong personalities and, things like that. I imagine it would be psychologically devastating to try to adapt to a disability like this coming from a place like that. That loss of independence, the loss of, empowerment that you could at least go out and make a living. Terrible. Thompson said it's unclear if long COVID would qualify her for the Ontario Disability Support Program, and that the process would take years. Even if she was eligible, Thompson says the maximum monthly amount of $11.69 Canadian would at best cover her rent. Quote, that would be the entirety of my living budget, she said. Canadians do not have to have a terminal illness to be eligible for MAID. Assisted suicide became legal in Canada in 2016, but only for those with a terminal illness whose natural death was, quote, reasonably foreseeable. However, that requirement was removed last year in a euthanasia law called Bill C-7 and was replaced with the condition that an illness, quote, cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable. Thompson said she was confident that she would get approval. Quote, as best I know, I would meet the criteria, she said. I'm very ill. There is no treatment. There is no cure. You don't have to be terminally ill. That's the end of the article. So please, somebody in an org somewhere, reach out to this woman. This is somebody who is giving up on life because of capitalism, because of lack of financial support. This is a prominent case. Obviously, this happens to people every single day who either outright commit suicide or, get involved with some sort of rapidly life deteriorating condition such as an addiction due to a similar situation. This is what's happening now. This is more fallout from the pandemic. So shifting back to the biological side, here's a story from the Indian Express dated June 22nd, 2022. The title is Six-Fold Monthly Rise in Heart Attacks in Mumbai in 2021 over previous years, per BMC data, due to COVID risk factor, delayed timely intervention, and better or inaccurate recording of data, say experts. It's by Rupsa Chakraborty. So, of course, there are going to be multiple factors affecting overall heart health statistics. That said, when we see a spike like this coincide with the pandemic, that is eyebrow-raising for sure. So, between January and June 2021, as many as 3,000 people lost their lives to heart attacks every month in the city, compared to 500 in 2020. Mumbai witnessed an over six-fold rise in monthly deaths related to heart attack in the first 6 months of 2021 compared to previous years. Between January and June 2021, as many as 3,000 people lost their lives to heart attacks every month in the city, compared to 500 in 2020. According to data provided by the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, BMC, a total of 5,849 patients lost their lives to heart attacks in Mumbai in 2019. This dropped by 3.6% when 5,633 patients succumbed to the disease in 2020. But between January and June 2021, a total of 17,880 succumbed to heart attacks in the city, a surge of 217% over the previous year, according to a reply to an RTI request filled by activist Chetan Kothari. Quote, pre-pandemic, cancer was the biggest killer, but last year, although deaths due to cancer subsided, heart attacks surged significantly, said a civic official. By the way, this just reminds me, I got into an argument on social media with some troll. They were from the PATSOC community, patriotic socialist right-wingers, who was trying to explain to me that COVID was not a big deal, that people should not demonstrate for COVID protections, etc. And I was trying to explain that COVID was the third leading cause of death in the U.S. in 2020 and 2021. And he's like, well, why aren't you demonstrating for the first two, which I believe were heart disease and cancer? So, couple things. First of all, heart disease, COVID contributes to that. And then cancer, with the T-cell depletion, COVID may also be contributing to that. But by and large, heart disease and cancer in and of themselves are not caused by an infectious, pandemic. Those are more chronic, quote, lifestyle diseases caused by diet and things like that. They are serious, and we should do things about them. At the end of the day, you are going to die of something. No one lives forever, though we are looking to improve quality of life, lifespan, having a happy, dignified life, things like that. But, so why aren't we demonstrating about heart disease? Well, I mean, there actually has been a lot done on that subject, etc. But it does come down to things that people eat and lifestyle choices that they make. Not necessarily an emergency pandemic, communicable, infectious disease kind of thing that is sweeping across the population. So, I don't know. Whether it's this or, the people who do the my body, my choice with vaccines and try to compare it to pregnancy, it's like, can't seem to understand the infectious disease component, emergency of the situation. In that case, pregnancy, not contagious. not an airborne virus. So, it's just tough. There's a lot of people who are pretty thick-headed when it comes to science out there. Anyway, continuing. Dr. Avinash Soup, in charge of the COVID-19 Death Committee, said that there are three major reasons for the surge in deaths related to heart attack. Possibility of development of thrombosis, that's clotting, among recovered COVID-19 patients, delay in diagnosis of patients during the pandemic, and better recording of data. Quote, globally, it has been witnessed that heart attack-related deaths increased during the pandemic, so it is not a new phenomenon that has only been observed in Mumbai. Secondly, since the start of the pandemic, medical practitioners are more conscious of segregation and bifurcation of types of deaths, so it has possibly helped maintain better data pertaining to heart attacks. It has been observed that SARS coronavirus 2 injures the heart and blood vessels in infected patients, which leads to the development of clots, heart inflammation, arrhythmias, that's irregular heartbeat, and heart failure. In August 2021, The Lancet reported that the risk of a first heart attack increased by 3 to 8 times in the week after a COVID-19 diagnosis. So COVID does a number on your heart. Dr. Kedar Todaskar, Director of Critical Care at Hart Hospital and member of Maharashtra COVID-19 Task Force, said, though there is no proven cause and effect relationship, the data suggest that COVID-19 infection was a risk factor for thrombosis, not only arterial, but venous thrombosis, which included deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary thromboembolism too, apart from acute coronary syndromes. So we have covered this before. What is a pulmonary embolism? Basically, a clot forms in usually one of your deep veins, so this will be a DVT, deep vein thrombosis. Thrombosis is a clot which forms in a blood vessel, and then if it dislodges and becomes free-floating in the bloodstream, it is an embolism. That free-floating clot can then lodge in difficult places and block the blood flow. If it lodges in the pulmonary artery, which is basically between the heart, it's blood coming from the heart to be oxygenated by the lung, basically lodges like on the way to the lung, that is really serious. We've covered this in more than one long COVID video before. COVID-19 is known to increase your risk of pulmonary embolism several fold, so significant risk increase there. And again, was any of this mentioned in the op-ed that we read at the beginning of this? No, not even recognized. The CDC knows it. It's being swept under the rug, and we're just left with channels like this having to cover it independently. This is sickening. It's a disgrace. There's a reason that we cover revolutionary Marxist-Leninist history and theory here on this channel, because people need to get educated in how to abolish this system. Continuing, quote, this is related to the virus interacting with the ACE2 receptors in the host body. So all the organs that have a predominance of ACE2 receptors are involved, which includes the endothelium. The endothelium is the inner lining of all vascular structures in the body, which includes the arterial and the venous system. COVID-19 typically causes inflammation of the endothelium, which is coined as COVID endotheliitis. This endotheliitis is the cause of increased thrombotic events, that would be microclots, thereby leading to increase in the cardiac mortality and morbidity seen in the second wave. Well, I said microclots, really clots of any size, but continuing. Also during the second wave, many patients avoided hospitals due to fear of contracting COVID-19, which further delayed life-saving treatment. By the way, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of people were catching COVID in the hospital. Dr. Prafulla Kirkar, interventional cardiologist, chairman of Guidelines Committee of Cardiological Society of India, CSI, said, it has been blamed on the pandemic when people with heart attack symptoms reached the hospital late, which pushed up the mortality rate. Reperfusion therapies like thrombolytic therapy that dissolve clots, and timely interventions like angioplasty, unquote. So in other words, it's not just COVID directly killing people. It's also COVID clogging up the hospitals and things so that people, for one reason or another, either can't get the treatment or they don't want to set foot inside the facility for fear of getting COVID. So again, we're looking at this now. It's maybe a step forward in the new CDC guidelines, the community guidelines, that they're including hospital capacity, but they've also thrown out the window a lot of other stuff. So now it looks like you don't need to mask as long as there's open hospital beds. That's a complete perversion of, incorporating the availability of hospital beds in there. Yes, that's important to think about. Is the medical system getting overwhelmed by the COVID cases? But it's not like, there are open beds in the ER. I can drink and drive today. That's not really the kind of public health thinking that anyone wants to see. He also said that there's a possibility that patients who died of pre-existing heart conditions like decompensated heart disease or heart failure, the heart doesn't pump blood as well as it should, were categorized as heart attacks without necessary intervention at a time when the health system was overwhelmed with COVID-19. Quote, a patient with heart failure is not identified as having a heart attack until it is shown in the ECG or EKG and cardiac enzyme levels are elevated. So there is a possibility that the data also include cases of heart failure, he said. So again, there is like a technical distinction there. It's still a problem of the heart, but possibly because the people were not at the hospital being diagnosed properly, there was a sort of guess after the fact. To better understand the trend, doctors say that there's a need for better investigation into the deaths and verbal autopsy of the deceased patients. Quote, but if these patients had no history of past or present COVID-19 infection and died of cardiac complications, then the causes could be major lifestyle changes, additional distress, or any new clinical anomaly yet to be analyzed. So it's advisable to read the data in conjunction with associated risk factors for cardiac complications, said Dr. Abdul Samad Ansari, Director of Critical Care Services, Nanavati Hospital. So yeah, like I said, a lot of things can cause heart disease, heart attacks, stress like diet, all kinds of things. That said, there's a pretty significant increase. So when we know that COVID does cause heart inflammation, the blood vessel diseases, the clotting, etc., then, when there's a spike in cases of some kind of fatal heart malfunction, that is definitely something to take a look at. Heart, very important organ, can't live for very long without it. So moving on to the next article, here's one from ABC News. This is titled, Researchers Are Studying Long COVID in Kids. Here's what they know so far. Misconceptions about COVID in kids slowed the study, researchers say. This is by Michael Depeau-Wilson, originally posted at MedPage Today, June 16, 2022. Obviously, unrelated video still there on the screen. For some reason, they decided to play that on this article. So let's get into it. While children were initially thought to be spared from the worst of SARS coronavirus 2, and time out there, this was always propaganda. Why would children be spared from a disease like that? It just doesn't make any sense on its face. Continuing. More than 2 years later, long COVID clinics are full of pediatric patients, with parents looking for guidance on a range of symptoms affecting their kids' daily lives. The emergent nature of long COVID makes it especially difficult to define, diagnose, and treat, particularly for children, according to Lawrence Kleinman, MD, MHP, of the Department of Pediatrics at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in New Brunswick, New Jersey. What does the emergent nature of long COVID mean? It means that it is still emerging, the details are still a bit murky, and not everything has settled out yet. Quote, if you look at some of the early information that came out, you can go find headlines on the web that said that children are spared. We started this pandemic thinking kids weren't a part of it, and it's impacted the policy ever since, Kleinman told MedPage Today. Quote, and we know that that's just not true. It's a myth, unquote. And yeah, like I said, it violates every rule of common sense. As part of the steering committee for the Recover Initiative, a National Institutes of Health-sponsored collaboration of more than 100 researchers, Kleinman has been focused on research in pediatric long COVID cases. By the way, if you're interested in this topic, check out the hashtag LongCovidKids. There's a lot written about it. There's a lot coming out of the UK about this. He noted that the pediatric side of the initiative is moving slowly, as they're still working on enrollment for the first phase of a large-scale, multi-clinic observational cohort study. In addition to Recover, other groups have been studying long COVID in children, including the Collaborative Long-Term Study of Outcomes of COVID-19 in Kids, or CLOC, Consortium at Rutgers, and the Prevail Kids team. The American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation is also planning to publish consensus guidance on diagnosing and treating long COVID in kids as part of their Post-Acute Sequelae of SARS coronavirus 2, or PASC, series. Dr. Amanda Morrow of Kennedy Krieger Institute and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, co-author of the PASC guidance, noted the many challenges that kids with long COVID face. Quote, "Sometimes these kids are written off, or they're not believed," she said. "We're really trying to educate clinicians and parents so that the children are believed, they're supported, so that they can really focus on their recovery," unquote. At the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which treats children and young adults aged 2 to 21 years, Morrow works with a multidisciplinary team that includes a neurologist, a physical therapist, a behavioral psychologist, and a social worker, with a neuropsychology team and education specialists available to work with kids who are struggling in school. Currently, the clinic has a month-long wait list for new parents. Patients at the clinic were previously healthy, with very few experiencing medical issues until their COVID-19 infections, which were mostly mild in nature, comment during the acute phase, Morrow noted. Now, they're all suffering from lingering symptoms such as fatigue, cognitive difficulties, dizziness, lightheadedness, headaches, and difficulty with physical activity. Some are dealing with mood-related symptoms, though she cautioned that these symptoms could be related to the patient's circumstances rather than the infection directly. Quote, "Many of our kids are complaining of difficulty with school," Morrow said. "So some of the cognitive difficulties that you hear about in an adult, for children, that's manifesting as difficulty with schoolwork, dropping grades, having trouble paying attention in class, the ability to participate in a full school day because of their symptoms." She's also worked with kids who are struggling with orthostatic intolerance, gastrointestinal symptoms, and pain issues. Quote, "I think as far as the treatment, it's kind of a rehabilitation approach. We're really focusing on patient functioning and improving their quality of life despite whatever symptoms that they're experiencing, because right now we do not have a cure for long COVID," Morrow explained. "So we're supporting them. We're using our medical knowledge and we're borrowing from other diseases and illnesses with overlapping symptoms. We're borrowing management strategies from those to help these kids feel better," unquote. So a comment there, surely people working in a long COVID clinic would probably be familiar with the theory and evidence that long COVID is caused by a persistent infection. So there are in fact a number of theories about what is causing long COVID, and it may be a number of these all overlapping with each other. We've used this screenshot in a previous COVID update. This is from a video on the Gez Medinger Run DMC channel. It's an interview with Dr. Amy Prohl. And on the screen, they're talking about the 5 sort of top theories related to what causes long COVID. 1, dysregulated immune response. We know that COVID pretty severely impacts T cells, for starters. 2, autoimmunity, triggering autoimmune reactions in the body. 3, viral debris. This is not the whole virus, but just like pieces of COVID, particularly probably the spike protein, still circulating in the body and causing ongoing inflammation and problems. 4 is viral persistence. This is actually the whole virus, like a persistent low-level infection continuing. And then 5, reactivated latent viruses. In other words, after you get sick and you get over a virus, it's not necessarily completely gone. So, for example, the tonsils can be reservoirs for adenoviruses, and basically you can still have viruses in your body, whole intact viruses, that just your body has sort of subdued and sequestered, but they're not completely gone. And it's possible that during the COVID infection, some of these get reactivated. There's a lot of evidence for viral persistence, though. We're actually going to look at a study on that to close out this particular video today. But the reason that I mentioned that is she's talking here about borrowing strategies from other diseases and management strategies. I get that, and we don't have a cure for long COVID, but I was just looking at some evidence that Paxlovid, being antiviral, that sort of directly attacks the infection in the body and challenges its existence, at least anecdotally so far, seems to offer some people some relief. So something possibly to look into in the future. Anyway, just mentioning that. Continuing, Kleinman noted that the concerns around long COVID in children extend beyond school performance and daily life. Quote, "We also don't know, and this is particularly salient for kids who are going to live a long time, what is beneath the surface," he said. "When you think about the iceberg, the prototypical iceberg," I think he may mean proverbial iceberg, but anyway, "the symptoms are above the surface. Maybe the laboratory tests that you can look at are at the surface or just immediately below the surface. And then there's stuff that's going to pretend for the future that is deeper below the surface." I think that that's actually a really good point. What is causing the symptoms here may be quite different from, what you would think of as normally causing those symptoms. There may be something going on far below the surface that it may take some time to track down. Continuing, "While research efforts are underway, it will take time to understand long COVID in children," he added. "In the meantime, it's important for the medical community to know that COVID-19 and long COVID are very real concerns for children," he urged. And can I just add, I hate this aspect of the medical establishment so much. The fact that you have to do such a song and dance so many times, the amount of just gaslighting in a clinical setting is unreal. Quote, "Folks should not be comfortable in the idea that children aren't an important part of this pandemic, because they clearly are, have been, and continue to be," he said. All right, so that's a little bit about long COVID in kids. We were talking about that in the Fair Health study before. If you want more particular stats about what some aspects of long COVID look like in kids. All right, let's move on to our second to last article. This is from March 30, 2022, published in The Guardian opinion. "We need answers to these 4 long COVID questions," by Charlie McCone. "I was a fit 30-year-old, and long COVID has destroyed my life. It's frustrating how little action there has been. Nobody asked for this condition, nor were they warned about its possibility, and now sufferers are being hung out to dry with no support. Hi, my name is Charlie, and long COVID has destroyed my life. Before my, quote, mild infection, I was a healthy, fit 30-year-old, biking 10 miles a day with no prior health issues, the type of person the CDC says should bounce back after 2 weeks. Well, it's been 2 years, and I've yet to bounce back. I can't work or leave the house, and I rely on my partner as a full-time caretaker. I still can't breathe right. It is a living nightmare. Writing this piece would have taken me 1 evening before I was sick, but now this level of cognitive exertion takes an entire week to complete. There are millions suffering through this every day, stuck in a twilight zone of never-ending debilitating symptoms for months, and now years after infection. And with a reported 10 to 30% of infections leading to this condition, we are witnessing the greatest mass disabling event in human history, the scale of which demands the same Operation Warp Speed type of urgency that was given to acute COVID and the development of vaccines. This is still a new disease, and it will take time to understand everything. However, research is quickly unraveling the disease process, and it is no longer a complete mystery. So while we can only push science so fast, here are my 4 questions about the treatment, support, and prevention of long COVID. 1. Why don't we have diagnostics yet for microclots? Great news! All your labs look normal, is the dreaded phrase long COVID patients hear repeatedly from their medical team. It often leads to a minimization and dismissal of their symptoms. Current clinical diagnostics have proven insufficient for the diagnosis and treatment of long COVID, along with other long-standing post-viral illnesses such as ME and CFS. However, the latest research is developing dozens of new diagnostic methods that have identified explicit biological abnormalities in the long COVID disease process. Among the most promising is the detection of amyloid microclots using fluorescence microscopes. In research studies so far, they have been detected in 100% of patients tested for them. This is a simple blood draw that could provide a critical biomarker for millions, and it has immediate implications for treatment. A biomarker is a substance that's identified in the body as an indicator of some process, such as a disease. In fact, the process is so simple that patients are sneaking into labs after hours to have technicians run the test for them. Why can't long COVID clinics begin incorporating this simple lab draw into their suite of services? If you run a clinic and are reading this, email this link to your lab director right now and ask them, can we run this test? There is a good chance that they will say yes. When this research around microclots was published last summer, I was optimistic that we'd have some form of treatment option by early 2022, or at least a new diagnostic. We can't continue to go through this health crisis with significant scientific breakthroughs sitting on the shelf for 6 months, and more, without any attempt at replication, trial, or action. We need to prioritize expediting these newly discovered diagnostics into the clinical setting now. Question 2. Why is there still no public health warning? We've known for well over a year how prevalent and severe long COVID is, yet the public remains largely uninformed around its risk. While the likelihood of someone developing the condition after infection has ranged from 5% or 50%, a recent meta-analysis pins it to 20 to 30%, and 10% if vaccinated, the most conservative estimate still amounts to 1 in 20 people. A quote, medically rare event is 1 in 1,000. This is not a rare event by any means. As the Mayo Clinic research team recently said, regardless of where the final number ends up, quote, this is a condition that is not rare. So why are we not warning the public? If public health institutions want to establish trust with the public, they need to be honest about what the science is telling us. Right now, they are not, and their silence around long COVID can be described as misinformation around the risk of infection, which is no different than anti-vaccination misinformation around the risk of vaccines. Comment, although one goes in one direction, the misinformation around the risk of infection is minimizing the risk, and the anti-vaccination misinformation is overstating the risk of vaccines. Continuing. In addition, studies demonstrate informing the public about long COVID encourages them to follow public health guidelines and reduces vaccine hesitancy. In other words, it encourages compliance because people realize this is actually something serious that they should, in fact, take seriously, and it's worth modifying their behavior for it. So what's going on? Let me take a guess. It would be difficult to promote a policy of endemic infection that resembles a mild seasonal flu, while simultaneously warning the public that 1 in 10 infected, or more, will go on to develop a chronic illness, regardless of infection severity. In other words, it doesn't fit nicely with a strategy of unmitigated spread where we are, quote, living with COVID. As I like to say, living with COVID equals dying and becoming disabled from COVID. Any decision that ignores long COVID at the cost of a humming economy and, quote, returning to normal is not only immoral and craven, it's severely flawed. Long COVID is already having a devastating impact on the economy. In the U.S., the most conservative estimates are that 1.6 million are already out of the workforce due to long COVID. Yeah, I think it's a lot more than that. And in the U.K., a quarter of employers cite it as a leading reason for long-term absence. So if we want folks to participate in a working economy and retain a normal way of life, we need to protect them by informing them about the risk of infection. It's long overdue to acknowledge and count long COVID and begin measuring this pandemic in deaths, hospitalizations, and disability. Question 3. Why haven't we started meaningful treatment trials for long COVID? I'm enrolled in the RECOVER trial, led by the National Institutes of Health, and during the orientation, they informed me that, quote, the first few years will be observational, and then we hope to begin considering treatments after that, unquote. Do we have time to wait 2 years or more until meaningful treatment trials begin for a disease that's affecting 10 to 30% of the globally infected population? There are already dozens of promising case studies that have identified treatments in response to clear biological abnormalities, viral persistence, immune dysregulation, endothelial dysfunction, autoantibodies, and the aforementioned microclots, all of which should have already prompted trials. This is where patients are genuinely confused. Lack of action doesn't make sense economically, politically, or medically. We have enough data and research on the disease process to begin fast-tracking small-scale trials today. Multi-year observational studies are not going to cut it. Patients continue to go to their doctors and share the promising case studies being published every month, and the only response is, We need trials before we can consider this treatment. Okay, where are the trials? Question 4. What is the plan to support those who've lost their jobs and housing due to long COVID? See the earlier article about the woman in Canada. My short-term disability runs out soon, and I have no clue what I'm going to do. And I'm fortunate enough to have a supportive job and family, good health insurance, and a team of doctors who understand the severity of this condition. Many are not so fortunate. We know that long COVID is destroying careers, pushing teachers and first responders into homelessness, and completely upending the financial security of families across the globe. Long-term disability is now being flooded and is denying benefits to the majority of patient applicants. This is a disaster. Nobody asked for this condition, nor were we warned about its possibility, and now sufferers are being hung out to dry with no support from one of the greatest fallouts of this pandemic. We know that pandemics disable people, and policymakers should have been prepared for this. What is the plan here? I think the plan is clear. It's deny, obfuscate, and deny some more. So while we can only push the research so fast, that is not stopping us from addressing the most immediate needs of those suffering from long COVID or to protect others from developing the condition. It's clear we're waiting for our governments, medical and public health institutions, and the media to catch up with the science. What are we waiting for? Charlie McCone is a 32-year-old long COVID patient and advocate based in San Francisco. He tweets about long COVID at Los Charlos, Loscharlos. So now on to the final article, which is a study, in this case, of this video. The title of this is Persistent Circulating SARS Coronavirus 2 Spike is Associated with Post-Acute COVID-19 Sequelae. It's a study by Zoe Swank, Yasmin Sanusi, Galit Alter, and David R. Walt, affiliated with the Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Department of Pathology in Boston, a bunch of things in Boston. Anyway, so this is, when we're talking about a biomarker, they're looking for something where if you detect its presence, or you detect its presence in combination with some other thing, then it serves as basically an indicator of the disease. So they can diagnose a bit easier and maybe also understand what is causing this thing. So in the last article, we had discussion of a possible biomarker being the microclots, here, circulating spike protein. So let's get into it, starting with the abstract. The diagnosis and management of post-acute sequelae, or consequences of COVID-19, PASC, poses an ongoing medical challenge. Identifying biomarkers associated with PASC would immensely improve the classification of PASC patients and provide the means to evaluate treatment strategies. We analyzed plasma samples collected from a cohort of PASC and COVID-19 patients. N equals 63. N is your sample size. I would say 63 is on the small side, but let's see what they come up with. To quantify circulating viral antigens and inflammatory markers. Strikingly, we detect SARS coronavirus 2 spike antigen in a majority of PASC patients, up to 12 months post-diagnosis, suggesting the presence of an active, persistent SARS coronavirus 2 viral reservoir. In other words, somewhere in your body is storing the virus. Furthermore, temporal antigen profiles for many patients show the presence of spike at multiple time points over several months, highlighting the potential utility of the SARS coronavirus 2 full spike protein as a biomarker for PASC. So again, PASC here basically being a synonym for long COVID, post-acute sequelae, so things that happen after the acute phase of COVID-19, but which are a consequence of COVID-19. So the results. We analyzed plasma samples from a cohort of 63 individuals previously infected with SARS coronavirus 2, 37 of whom were diagnosed with PASC. For most of the PASC patients, N equals 31, so that's about half, blood samples were collected 2 or more times up to 12 months after their first positive result with either a nasopharyngeal swab RT-PCR test, it's the usual PCR test where they stick the thing up your nose, or an anti-SARS coronavirus 2 antibody test. Blood was also collected from individuals who suffered from COVID-19 but were not diagnosed with PASC up to 5 months post-diagnosis. The majority of PASC patients were female, N equals 30, consistent with other studies that found that women are predominantly affected by persistent symptoms following SARS coronavirus 2 infection. Of the individuals who were not diagnosed with PASC, N equals 26, 10 were admitted to the ICU and 7 were intubated. A complete overview of patient characteristics is provided in Supplementary Table 1. Using previously developed and optimized ultrasensitive single molecule array, or SIMOA assays, we measured the concentration of SARS coronavirus 2 antigens. Antigens are basically foreign things that your body doesn't like. You can also have autoantigens where your body identifies its own tissue as something that it doesn't like, but it's basically an antigen, something your body is trying to get rid of, including the S1 subunit of spike, full-length spike, and nucleocapsid. Nucleocapsid is the wrapper of the virus, basically, the thing that the spikes stick off of. In the collected plasma samples, we were able to detect either S1, spike, or N in approximately 65% of the patients diagnosed with PASC at any given time point, several months after SARS coronavirus 2 infection. Out of all 3 antigens measured, we detected spike most often in 60% of the PASC patients, whereas we did not detect spike at all in the COVID-19 patients. S1 was detected to a lesser degree in about 1/5 of the PASC patients, and N was detected in a single patient at multiple time points. In line with our previous work, we detected S1 and N in COVID-19 patients, often those hospitalized with severe disease and within the first week post-diagnosis, but we did not detect the full spike protein in any of these patients. A number of PASC patients and a subset of COVID-19 patients' blood samples were collected at multiple time points, allowing us to analyze the change in antigen levels over time. Of the PASC patients for which we had longitudinal samples, that is, over time, we detected antigen more than once in 12 patients, reinforcing the persistent presence of circulating antigen. In only a few cases, the presence of S1 or spike may be correlated with vaccination. However, according to our previous findings, S1 is only detected within the first 2 weeks after the first dose, and spike is rarely detected. Most significantly, we observed patterns of sustained full spike antigen levels over the course of several months in many patients. In other cases, we observed fluctuations between antigen being detected and not detected, indicating that the time of sampling is important. In contrast, temporal antigen profiles of 6 COVID-19 patients show high antigen levels soon after diagnosis, quickly dropping below the limit of detection. We also measured the plasma concentrations of a panel of cytokines, including, oh boy, there's a lot of interleukins mentioned here. You can read that on the screen, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, but there were no clear findings. So cytokines are part of your immune system that activate other responses, but basically what the researchers are saying is that the levels of those cytokines did not really indicate anything. There were no patterns detected, so not really useful as a biomarker in their estimation. Continuing. Discussion. With the goal of discovering biomarkers that correlate with PASC, we measured the concentration of SARS coronavirus 2 antigens and cytokines in plasma samples collected from a cohort of PASC and COVID-19 patients. Most notably, we detected circulating SARS coronavirus 2 spike in the majority of PASC patients, but in none of the COVID-19 patients who did not have PASC. Although our sample size is small, so they do acknowledge that, the detection of spike at multiple time points, 2 to 12 months after infection, is compelling. Temporal fluctuations in antigen levels for a subset of individuals indicates the importance of longitudinal sampling, as we may not have detected antigen in some cases if blood was only collected at a single time point. By the way, not related to that sentence, I apologize, I should have read this sooner. This is a preprint from June 16, 2022, posted at the Med Archive. I was reading this is a very interesting study so far, and just suddenly occurred to me, when is this from again? I didn't screenshot that, but anyway, it is from June 16, 2022. It is still pending peer review, but it is what it is. Okay, continuing. Furthermore, those who volunteered to participate in PASC studies tend to have been hospitalized with severe COVID-19, notwithstanding that the majority of those who acquire SARS coronavirus 2 and develop PASC are not hospitalized. So, again, the hospitalized patients who are hospitalized during the acute phase tend to be overrepresented in the long COVID or PASC group, but overall, still the majority will not have been hospitalized. Continuing. The minority of our PASC cohort was hospitalized, N equals 2, suggesting that our findings relate to SARS coronavirus infection rather than effects that arise after severe illness and hospitalization. The presence of circulating spike supports the hypothesis that a reservoir of active virus persists in the body. Another preliminary study found SARS coronavirus 2 RNA in multiple anatomic sites up to 7 months after symptom onset, corroborating the viral antigen persistence. Post-mortem tissue analysis revealed the presence of SARS coronavirus 2 RNA and viral-specific protein expression, not only in respiratory tissues, but also in cardiovascular, lymphoid, gastrointestinal, peripheral nervous, and brain tissues in the majority of individuals analyzed, N equals 44. Wow. So SARS keeps kicking in many major organs, your lungs, heart and blood vessels, lymph tissue, your GI system, your peripheral nervous system, and your brain. So I had heard before that the gut, the GI system might be a reservoir of COVID, but they're saying they find it everywhere pretty much. That's crazy. Not everywhere, but many, many large locations. Furthermore, in our previous study, a reservoir of replicating SARS coronavirus 2, so still active, still reproducing itself, was found to occur in the gastrointestinal tract of children who develop multisystem inflammatory syndrome, MISC. So MISC is one of the main sort of dangerous symptoms that children get from COVID, and it's just like it sounds, multisystem inflammatory syndrome. You get major inflammation in multiple major body systems. In that study, we detected elevated levels of circulating spike weeks after the initial SARS coronavirus 2 infection due to leakage from the gut into the bloodstream. So comment there, normally your digestive tract passes things along, and things from the food and drink that you ingest get absorbed through the villi, which are little sort of hair-like cells that extend into your digestive tract, into your intestines, and absorb things. Sometimes, though, there are holes, leaks in your gut lining, and things get directly into the bloodstream without that filtering process. That can cause a host of problems, but anyway, they're saying that the leakage from the gut of the spike protein is causing that. Anyway, in another study, analysis of the gut microbiome, that's all the microorganisms that live in your gut. Did you know that there are more non-human cells in your body than there are human cells? Well, now you do. They're not all in your gut, but many of them are. Anyway, in another study, analysis of the gut microbiome up to 6 months after SARS coronavirus 2 infection revealed alterations in the gut microbiome composition that correlated with PASC, suggesting that certain conditions or predispositions may foster the persistence of replicating viral reservoirs. If viral reservoirs persist in the body of PASC patients, then why do we not also detect circulating nucleocapsid in a larger proportion of patients? So in other words, they're asking, if there is whole replicating virus, why are they just finding the spike protein, and why are they not also finding that wrapper? Basically a virus, if you look it up, they look like, well, it depends. They can look like soccer balls with stuff sticking off of them. They can look kind of like spiders. But there's usually this nucleocapsid that contains genetic information, either RNA or DNA. And anyway, that's the nucleocapsid. So they're saying if there is whole virus that is, quote, alive, viruses aren't truly alive, but they're capable of replicating, then why aren't you finding that nucleocapsid wrapper? So they continue, it's possible that nucleocapsid is preferentially hydrolyzed. In other words, split and broken down, digested roughly. Whereas spike may be more efficiently transported into the bloodstream, evading degradation. Alternatively, circulating anti-nucleocapsid antibodies may be more effective at clearing nucleocapsid compared to the anti-spike antibodies produced. Furthermore, PASC is a heterogeneous syndrome, possibly dependent on the tissue in which the viral reservoir persists. So in other words, they're saying, first of all, that possibly the nucleocapsid is being hydrolyzed first, like it's very easy to do that, and preferentially, so it's not really making it into the bloodstream at the same rate that the spike protein is, or that the anti-nucleocapsid antibodies may be more effective at getting rid of it, or they point out that this is a heterogeneous, what does that mean? Varied, basically, syndrome that may depend, some of its particular characteristics may depend on which tissue the coronavirus is hanging out in that particular person. You know, some people might be more the lung. Anyway, this is a hypothesis at this point. And that, you know, which tissue it's hanging out in may be handling the nucleocapsid versus the spike protein differently. Anyway, this heterogeneity may have an effect on whether spike or N is then detected. Further investigations are necessary to resolve these unanswered questions. Persistent viral reservoirs are a likely cause of PASC symptoms, but circulating spike may also give rise to symptoms. So comment, we looked at this on the Gesmedinger screenshot before. Obviously, if you have a viral reservoir that is still replicating and active, that can be causing disease, and so it can be contributing to the symptoms of the long COVID, but also just the degraded leftover spike protein circulating in the blood, that even on its own, even though it's not attached to a functional virus that's capable of replication, can cause inflammation. We've looked at in past videos how some of the spike proteins can directly activate inflammatory responses, as well as just your body doesn't want them in there and is trying to activate its own immune processes to try to clear them, which can, you know, set your body off in a number of ways. So anyway, similar to bacterial superantigens, SARS coronavirus 2 spike protein contains structural motifs that strongly interact with T cell receptors, creating an imbalance in the T cell receptor repertoire. Unique to SARS coronavirus 2, it's thought that the superantigen-like motif may account for the hyperinflammatory response observed in severe COVID and MIS-C patients. Although spike does not instigate a cytokine storm in PASC patients, that's a particular type of phenomenon, it could act through other mechanisms that do interfere with normal cellular function. For instance, spike alone was shown to disrupt signaling pathways and induce dysfunction in parasites, vascular endothelial cells, and the blood-brain barrier. Alternatively, PASC may manifest as cellular exhaustion or the induction of refractory inflammatory response, but with persistent tissue-localized dysfunction. If PASC is the result of persistent viral replication in tissues outside the lung, it may also explain why changes in circulating inflammatory markers may be subtle when measured in blood, although they may be elevated within a given tissue. Other work indicates a trend towards elevated interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha in PASC patients, although fold changes compared to controls are small. In a different study, the combination of inflammatory mediators, including interleukin-6 and others, there are several others listed, was found to be a more informative predictor of PASC. Therefore, even though we do not observe cytokine levels to be elevated above the normal range in most cases, monitoring cytokines over time in a larger cohort warrants future investigation. Furthermore, the absence of any distinguishing serological features in our PASC cohort may be due to the late sampling times post-infection. Lower titers of IgM and IgG3 measured during acute infection correlate with the development of PASC, but over time, many immunological signatures may diminish, emphasizing the importance of analyzing patient samples near the time of primary infection and over the long term. So the Ig things, those are immunoglobulin, again, part of your immune system. So they're looking for biomarkers, and basically, although their study was not conclusive, they're suggesting further research questions for other people working with these things. In conclusion, the presence of circulating spike in PASC patients up to 12 months post-diagnosis strongly suggests that SARS coronavirus 2 viral reservoirs persist in the body. Additionally, the detection of spike in a majority of individuals included in our past cohort provides strong support for the use of spike as a biomarker for PASC. If PASC patients can be identified based on the direct measurement of spike protein, characterizing patient phenotypes and assessing treatment strategies will become increasingly effective. So they go on in some detail with the materials and methods, but we can skip that. Anyway, overall, I would say excellent study, asked a lot of the right questions, and this is the picture that seems to be shaping up. The next question is, if, long COVID is caused by viral reservoirs, how do we get rid of it? I mentioned before, anecdotally, there are some reports that people experiencing long COVID taking Paxlovid did experience a reduction in symptoms. And again, subjective, anecdotal, there need to be bigger studies using, antiviral agents on this to, whatever is going to clear that last remaining reservoir. If that's what's causing the long COVID, then how do we get rid of it, But closing it in on some particular specific question that is answerable, that is key here, rather than this being, this amorphous sort of, intimidating and seemingly everlasting problem. It doesn't need to be that way. And in fact, there is a lot of research that is starting to pin it down. What we can turn that into and, how that gets distributed throughout society, that those remain big questions that are outside the realm of the biological sciences. So anyway, that's the video, and there will be more COVID updates, particularly following up on the immune system damage and dysfunction caused by long COVID. And these are important things to understand. Again, educating the public about the actual risks. We're not just worried about the acute phase here. We are also worried about long COVID, which is really debilitating. There is no treatment for it yet that is really proven to work, really even established, let alone like consistently, solidly proved to work. And so that is a work in progress just on the sort of medical, biological side. On the social side, in the meantime, there is a lot of assistance that people need. There's different public health messaging that needs to be done. And these are things we can start clamoring for and protesting for and demanding today, but we have to get organized to do it. Anyway, that's the video. Again, we'll be back with more COVID updates very soon, and then eventually we will get back to audiobooks and other topics more specific to socialist theory and history. In the meantime, what did you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Really like hearing from people, especially about your COVID experiences, if you're comfortable sharing them, because a lot of people experiencing these things are feeling very alone. And really, you're not alone. A lot of people are suffering from these problems. So anyway, thanks again for watching. And also thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. So I really appreciate those. That financial support has allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I would have been able to do without that support. So that support has made videos like this possible. Then, after the videos have been produced and uploaded, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's thanks, good video, whatever it is. All of that helps to boost it in the YouTube algorithm, which then recommends it to more viewers, expanding the audience. That's what we want to do. We want to make it easier to stumble across this kind of content, because a lot of people have questions about what's going on in society today. What is oppression? What is class exploitation? And we're trying to get people connected with the answers that they need to successfully struggle against capitalism and to abolish it. Thanks again, and we'll catch you in the next video.